Drain the swamp will never happen in the Washington, D.C. metro area. The Washington, D.C. metro area is this era's version of the Roman Empire. Now, before I go into some of the anecdotal stories I've heard from friends, either secondhand or thirdhand, I've been here in the Washington, D.C. metro area for 20 years, developing connections and speaking off the record. Before I was an adult, also, I would just hear stories. But I want to preface this first, that there is a ton of waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse at every single federal government agency. The worst one is, as far as I know around here from stories, is the Pentagon, the Department of Defense. They have the most waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse. But I want to preface this that there are some good, honest, hardworking, selfless government employees here who believe in their job, who actually take their job seriously. However, and I think this is either brainwashing or naivete from a lot of Americans, that those amount of bureaucrats, federal government employees, are the minority in every federal government agency. So I've heard that those numbers from people who are either off the record working in federal government agencies or have worked and are retired or just quit out of disgust, out of anger and frustration because they couldn't take the ineptitude and corruption anymore, that in some government agencies there is 10% of all the total employees there who are actually doing their job and take it seriously and are not doing a bunch of crazy things like punching into work on time and then going on a enormously long coffee break, sometimes 2-hour coffee break, come back from the coffee break, punch back in right before lunch, do an hour of work, leave, take a 2-hour lunch, and then come back, work for another hour, and then leave work early. These are frequently common. So I've heard tons of these things. Unfortunately, the mainstream media, and they deserve a ton of the blame for this, for allowing this to continue, I know for a fact, because I've spoken with former Department of Energy and other employees in other government agencies who have wanted to tell their stories and wanted things fixed at these federal government agencies, okay? They've wanted to go on the record and clean things up. And you know what? The mainstream media does not care. Okay, maybe a small reporter at the bottom cares, but you know what? By the time this goes up the chain, they don't care. It doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't fit the political agenda. The mainstream media, who is almost all Democrat, unless it hurts Republicans, and there are a lot of Republicans in the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, but in general, that is off limits for the Democrat mainstream media. They will not heavily criticize the Pentagon or the Department of Defense. CNN even has a full-time reporter in the Pentagon that reports there every day. More like a PR spokesman, but anyway. So there is, if you meet another American, this show's off the cuff. I'm just going to, some of you guys said you want some more stories. Some of the dating stories do tie into this because over the years I have been on some dates with either current or former federal government employees, and I've heard stories from them. You know, just stories of just blatant ineptitude, or people like bragging about not doing any work on the job and complaining about still making $65,000 per year plus Cadillac healthcare benefits and retirement plan, complaining that they only get like 1% pay increases per year, stuff like that. I even had I still have, although he's not as bad, I had a stalker who worked at the Pentagon. Okay, I didn't know he was crazy. He was working in the Department of Defense and the Pentagon. I didn't know he was crazy at the time, so I met him in person for some lunches and some beers, and this was before I found out he was crazy. He was leaving work at lunchtime or after lunchtime to go meet me. So he was skipping work, and he was telling me that, oh, I'll never get fired. He was telling me that he was, like, looking at porn at work, and that he was talking with, like, these, he was arranging, like, flying down to Colombia and Peru and stuff every 4 to 6 weeks to have sex with hookers. He eventually got fired. Now, I don't know if this is common if guys get fired like this, but the federal government employees I have spoken to, the ones who are still working there and have spoken to me off the record, the mainstream media does not do their job. There are people who want this stuff cleaned up, who want the swamp drained from inside the swamp, and the mainstream media will not do a thing. There are some good journalists out there, like the Daily Caller. Judicial Watch is not technically a journalist but they do actually do some activism and journalism. They do a lot of FOIA and Freedom of Information requests exposing the waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse. James O'Keefe of Project Veritas, even though he's constantly harassed, he does do a good job exposing this. When he did catch some federal government employees breaking the law, there was 1 or 2 of them fired. So if there was a video embarrassing these federal government employees, 1 or 2 of them do go down, but it doesn't fix the system. A couple of them, 1 or 2 are sacrificed to maintain the system, but that is it. So if you are, and the reason I'm doing this video is I get asked this all the time since I live here. Okay, and I've compiled all these stories. One of my friends who writes an investing newsletter, he asked me to write like a short piece about how bad things are in DC. And I've been seeing posts from people, some of my podcast listeners, saying that most federal government bureaucrats and employees are not the problem. This is not true. Most of them are the problem, okay? This area, there is enormous political bias. People do not do their job objectively as they should. And I could just cite countless examples of this. There's countless examples that I've heard in the 20 years I've lived in this area before I was an adult. And even when I was just hanging out with like friends and their parents were either lobbyists or federal government employees, I would just hear just crazy stories. Like, what the hell is this? I can't believe it. And they would just laugh like, well, that's too bad, or I can't believe it's happening too, but it's not going to get fixed, so what can we do? And, you know, I've even heard stories of people trying to take it to the media, and the mainstream media, and in general, the mainstream media doesn't care. Rand Paul, if you want an example of how the mainstream media doesn't care about this, about the waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse, the many billions of dollars per year that each federal government agency wastes, the Pentagon, by the way, guys, Donald Trump just gave them, and Donald Trump's not draining the swamp. He's going to make things worse. And I'll say, like, I'll lay out the case why. But the Pentagon wastes so much money, and Trump is giving them like $200 billion more in budget per year, saying that they need to upgrade their all their equipment and technology and all this. Well, if the Pentagon was running their budget efficiently, they wouldn't need the extra $200 billion per year, okay? Some of the stories I've heard from people like former government contractors and people who just quit frustrated with the system. I've heard of people where scandals were literally buried under the rug, okay, where like a defense contractor overbilled the Pentagon. It was like one guy, I heard this second or third hand, so I didn't speak to the person but there was a guy who was bragging that he ripped off the Pentagon by over $80 million and that he had overcharged them by that much money. And it was like one guy who opened up like a shitty office and the whole thing was a fraud. He had stolen the money and he was bragging he had ripped off the Pentagon, and the military people had swept this stuff under the rug. And the media, I don't think, really covered any of this. Maybe they did at one point, but the majority of stories that happen with the waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse, the media will not cover. Occasionally you see a story in the Daily Caller, the mainstream media bashes the Daily Caller and calls them garbage. The mainstream media bashes James O'Keefe of Project Veritas. The mainstream media bashes Rand Paul. Rand Paul is actually one of the few congressmen or women who will publicly, you know that Festivus report, his list of grievances? So the mainstream media routinely calls him a nut job and bashes him, but he lists a lot of the waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse from a lot of the different federal government agencies every single year. He is trying to fix things. So I've heard my listeners in the past talk about term limits for Congress. Yes, that would be great. I've heard them also talk about, the new laws on lobbying. Okay, that would be important too. But the main problem here that most people do not understand is, so each individual bureaucrat, federal government employee does not have a ton of power individually, but collectively they have an enormous amount of power over whether or not they can implement or enforce policies. So they can delay policies or selectively enforce things, or they can, because they have a lot of resources to allocate from their government budget. And it's funny because a lot of them ridiculously claim that if they had more time and more resources, they could solve all the problems. It's just ridiculous in a lot of cases. But they waste so much money, and Catherine Austin Fitts has talked about this publicly because she was the assistant secretary for HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and she has told anecdotal stories, and I've heard the same stories. not in her department necessarily, but in other government agencies, where basically someone who's working in federal government is in charge of allocating a budget, and they're looking to do deals, side deals, for like unbidded contracts and stuff like that with a corporation. So when they decide to leave the public sector after they're most people aren't aware of this, but if you work for the federal government for 10 years in a row, your student loan debt is wiped out. Okay? So if you work for the federal government for 10 years, your student loan debt's all gone. It can be forgiven. But a lot of these guys, if they work that long here, and by the way, there's a lot of them entry level, the pay scales are different for a lot of federal government agencies, but the entry level salaries is between $40,000 and $65,000 per year. And that is a much higher entry level job than most private sector entry level jobs now. And so a lot of these federal government employees are still constantly complaining that they're underpaid and overworked and stuff. And a lot of them, honestly, from what I've heard, are just not doing their jobs. In fact, there's a nap studio. This is the first one I know of in the country. It's downtown, right next, a couple blocks from the White House, called Recharge. The guy used to be my best friend, and he got married, and now his wife won't let him talk to me anymore because I'm the dangerous single friend. But he was on the Shark Tank and trying to raise more money for this company, and the sharks just laughed at this guy because he's not making any money, it's losing a lot of money, and yet he found investors to expand locations of this nap studio, so some of these federal government employees and government contractors who skip out of work can go take naps for an hour or two. Okay, not get fired. But the system, and I know I'm going off tangent, and I know I'm rambling. I didn't really feel like writing down a whole bunch of notes. I do have some of the notes in the emails that I sent my friend for his newsletter article, so I can go through some of the stuff. But there's my best friend, his mom worked in the federal government for decades, and she just retired a couple years ago, and she has a full pension. But just hearing some of the crazy stories from my best friend's mom about like the employees who didn't do any of the work, and she even had a boss, and some of these stories are going to make your blood boil, okay? She had a boss who literally worked 1 day per month and didn't even come into the office, and the boss was clearing over $100,000 per year, didn't get fired, was doing this for years, and was getting a mandatory pay increase, full pension, healthcare benefits, and I think she was even lobbying to try to get some type of promotion, because the promotion here is not necessarily on qualifications in a lot of federal government agencies. It's seniority or networking or ass kissing. So it's just incredibly frustrating. And some of the anecdotal stories I've heard of waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse from friends whose parents worked in the government or who used to work in the government, people listen to the podcast and worked in a federal government agency are just fed up. I've just heard stories there's books out about this now, by the way. One of the books that just came out in the last 12 to 18 months, the article's from June 14th, 2018. The book is by, let me get her name. She's the former White House stenographer, talking about rampant sex and drug use, and including White House reporters having sex in public on the Air Force One, and Obama administration employees who are married or have boyfriend or girlfriend routinely cheating on their spouse or their boyfriend or girlfriend on every single work trip out of the country, inside and outside the country. Her name is Beck Dorey, Dorey Stein, and her book is called From the Corner of the Oval, a Memoir. So that's just a tiny glimpse of all the craziness that is going on. But I have heard stories from second and third hand people who I know and trust, who have worked in the government, known for a while, and they're just fed up with it, that they've heard of coworkers, when they go on work trips in the United States, that they literally, for government employee expense accounts, they are maxing out money, wasting taxpayer money so they can cheat on their spouse, okay, husband or wife. So sometimes it's sex with a coworker, they're having inter-office affairs because they're bored, or they're ordering hookers, prostitutes, male and female ones, on taxpayer money, okay? And the mainstream media will not do their freaking job and will not cover this because they don't care. It does not fit the political narrative that they have, that these federal government employees are all hardworking, selfless, do the right thing types of people. Okay? And I'm probably going to get some really nasty emails. My stalker, who occasionally still bothers me, and I've debated filing a restraining order against him because he still harasses me years later. He's been doing this for, it was really bad 6 or 7 years ago, but he still occasionally harasses me still. I think he might have been the one who called the Virginia State Securities regulators on me. He may even start, because I brought him up here in this podcast and I know he still listens, he may start harassing me again on this. So it is a very, very naive position, or you're listening too much to the mainstream media, that there is not enormous waste, fraud, corruption, abuse, scandals. The Obama administration claimed it was scandal-free, okay? It could not have been further from the truth. The Department of Justice, which, by the way, like I said, I've been here 20 years. I've been coming back here for college to go to charity events and networking. I've been on dating apps and, spoken with women who work in federal government agencies. I've been on dates with federal government employees in the past. I've even dated a few federal government employees in the last couple years who were Trump supporters. And I've just heard the stories of all this craziness. Okay, it's just not getting fixed. The swamp cannot be drained. I kind of forgot my about the Obama scandals. So the point I wanted to make, though, with the Obama scandals is the mainstream media. So the mainstream media's narrative is that Trump is the most dishonest president in history. And according to either the New York Times or the Washington Post, President Trump has lied over 8,000 times. Some ridiculous number. Over 8,000 times. Well, they never counted any of the stuff Obama did, all the scandals Obama had, and they were enormous because he picked Hillary Clinton and he was letting her get away with a bunch of crazy shit in addition to that. But all of those scandals, the mainstream media let Obama get away with and was never called to task on. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Department of Justice will not hire. Now, obviously, Trump just got a Bush family puppet approved as Attorney General, but I have not met a single lawyer in the 20 years I've been here who is libertarian or Republican. It is all it just becomes more hardcore Democrat or Marxist every year, and they're hiring their pick from the Ivy League. So they occasionally don't hire Ivy League people, but they're hiring there is no ideological diversity. I think that's the best way of saying it. So the bureaucracy here in the Washington, D.C. metro area, first off, D.C. voted, I think, the highest percentage for Hillary Clinton. I think the voting percentage was 90% or more votes cast for Hillary Clinton in Washington, D.C. In Northern Virginia, it was extremely high as well. And Maryland, it was high too. So for the people who say that there are some good federal government employees, I've met some, I've had lunch and dinner with some of them in person, and they do listen, some of them listen to my podcast. They are good people, but if they speak out or they try to fix things, they can be shamed, they can be ostracized, they can be threatened, they could be, and some of them at some point just get frustrated and fed up and angry with how broken the system is, how bad the bureaucracy is, and how much power the bureaucracy has to stop things. And this is why Trump is not getting a bunch of stuff done, because Trump cannot... Mike Cernovich has covered this better than anyone else, as far as I know, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Trump appointees that the Office of Personnel and also Congress will not approve. And that includes Republicans who will not approve Trump appointees. So Trump cannot get... We are over 2 years later here, and Trump cannot get most of his own people into key positions in different federal government agencies, okay? And I think that's why he settled for a Bush family puppet as Attorney General, because that was the only one that the Republicans and the Democrats were going to agree on. Crazy stuff, right? Hello, Kirsten. House of Cards has some of the stuff. It's loosely based on Lyndon B. Johnson and Bill Clinton. But if you go back and read the last couple hundred years of corruption in the Roman Empire, it's to those levels. The moral decay, the moral bankruptcy. I got people requesting more dating stories here, and I've matched with women who are like federal government employees on dating apps here, and it's on Bumble, so the woman has to message you first, and within 10 minutes of the woman messaging me, and it says none of this stuff on my profile. I'm not trying to pay a lot of money for first dates or anything like that. I'm not trying to waste a bunch of money like that. And these women are still, some of them, not all of them, but some of them are still asking. One of them, I have the screenshots, asked me to pay for her plastic surgery. She wanted boob job and liposuction, and she wanted to like negotiate and make like a sex for plastic surgery type of deal, like a dating arrangement. And there's other crazy stuff. That's one of the worst ones. I took screenshots of it. There's just so much craziness around the area, and I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of integrity and morals from a lot of the federal government employees. So the government employees individually do not necessarily have a ton of power, but collectively they have a bunch of power. Especially if a bunch of employees all hate Trump and they don't like his policies, there's things that they can do to slow it down. Now, they can't totally block it, but they can delay things. It's really sad. I can't believe it's come to this. When I moved here, I knew things were pretty bad. I did not know they were this bad. And honestly, every couple years to decade, it just gets worse. And the U.S. economy, the main reason, I spoke off the record with a bank lobbyist about this, with corruption and market manipulation, and the bank lobbyist told me, he's no names or anything like that, and he told me like straight up, like, it's all fiat money. That's the main reason that all of this market manipulation from Wall Street, all of this waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse from the Pentagon and from all these other federal government agencies can continue. Welfare and warfare, empire building, all this stuff. Hello, Scott. I don't know. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, are brainwashed and they want a socialist revolution. So they don't understand the truth about what's really happening here in DC, and they blame capitalism. And I can tell you that since we've had a central bank, and since we've had a permanent military-industrial complex, that we have not had anything close to real capitalism. It has been more like fascism for the economy, central planning, with large corporations being picked out as winners and losers, and then like an enormous welfare state to like, and bread and circus and stuff to bribe people in the masses who can't afford. If the mainstream, look, I know for a fact that the mainstream media people have been told a lot of this stuff, okay? I'll give you an example of this. Harry Markopolos, great book. No one would listen. He was the guy who figured out, math genius at working at a hedge fund, figured out in 10 minutes that Bernie Madoff was running a Ponzi scheme, and he handed mountains of evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission and other agencies, and no one, and Wall Street and the mainstream financial media, people on Wall Street like Jim Cramer and Ben Stein and CNBC anchors and other people in the mainstream financial media, and no one did anything. And he was worried that when the Madoff Ponzi scheme collapsed, the book is great. It's a thriller. It's exciting. You learn a lot. And he was worried that finally when the Madoff Ponzi scheme collapsed, that the SEC was just going to sweep it under the rug, cover it up, and put him in jail or kill him and destroy all of his evidence. So he made copies of the documents and he was faxing them to friends, and he was taking thumb drives. He had copies of all his documentation. He was sending them to different parts of the country for insurance. So, corruption is rampant, okay? It is rampant. Some agencies are worse than others. There are good, honest bureaucrats. They are the minority, though. And if they speak out too loudly, they risk their careers, they risk their pension, or worse. And if they try to take their story to anyone in the mainstream media won't run it. It doesn't benefit the mainstream media politically. It won't hurt the Republicans, and it doesn't fit the narrative that the government employees are good, honest, and you shouldn't criticize them. And Fox News, other than Tucker Carlson occasionally, most of the people on Fox News will not do it either. And there's a lot of Democrats and globalists and corrupt people working in Fox News as well. Chris Wallace and Shepard Smith, I really don't like those two. They're awful. So we're in a sad situation. Look, if it is really tough to be a normal adult here in the DC metro area because the people here around me do not act normal and responsible and do the things that normal adults should do. Okay, this area psychologically is and economically is a bubble. Okay, this area is extremely well insulated from inflation and taxes are high here, but most people make a pretty good living here because they are connected economically to the government. So I didn't look at a study, but offhand I could tell you that a ton of small, medium, and large-sized businesses that are considered private sector businesses here, and my brother even works for one of them, that guess who their one or two customers are? It's the Department of Defense or the Pentagon, okay? So there are a lot of businesses that are considered here in the state of Virginia and Maryland private sector businesses, but their only business, and in quotes, is being a parasite to the parasite. So I'm not good with fish, but whatever that tiny little barnacle is that's attached to the fish that eats off the shark. So there are tons and tons of parasites. So there are a lot of government agencies that crowd out the private sector, like real entrepreneurship and real small business and innovation. And then there are also companies that call themselves private sector companies, but all they are really also parasites of all different sizes. Booz Allen Hamilton's an enormous one. That's like one of the consulting ones, and they have all these consulting contracts with the Pentagon and Department of Defense, etc. And all they do, their only customers basically are just the Department of Defense and the Pentagon. And I also know this because when I graduated undergraduate in college, and before I went to law school, and I was looking at like some regular jobs, and I interviewed at some regular jobs. This was a long time ago, and I interviewed at one of these companies, and they were bragging about how they were the software salesperson to the Pentagon, like the main supplier of software to the Pentagon, and how they could overcharge the Pentagon and how good their business was. So like the management team in the job interviews were telling me this stuff. So, I mean, people brag and talk about the corruption like openly here, and the media won't cover it. So it's kind of like families here in the DC metro area, they just talk about it and joke about it. And the average American, because the media is not doing their job properly, the average American doesn't understand how bad it is. And because you have so much extra money here in the DC metro area, and the Pentagon's budget has expanded, and housing prices are good here in the DC metro area, even during the 2008 financial crisis, I think the average home price only dropped about 8%. It was the lowest drop, I think, in the whole country here in the Washington, D.C. metro area during 2008. Now, there was stuff out on the periphery, like in Loudoun County. There were all these developments that crashed and buildings stopped. But, you know, in the last 6 or 7 years, the amount of luxury condos and luxury townhouses and luxury single-family homes further and further away from D.C. has just exploded. And these things are expensive. They're building infrastructure out there, including like a train for people to take it from out there from 50 minutes without traffic away into DC, stuff like that. And, you know, that's what attracts all this extra money and stuff like that. In addition to, you know, the dating culture being ruined, that's what attracts all the hookers. Well, that and a lot of these federal government employees, a lot of them, because a lot of them do not fear getting arrested for felony or whatever. There are very few federal government employees that actually get busted and arrested for felonies. A lot of them don't even lose their pensions, okay, because they are very strong. And this is illegal. This is another contention point, that federal government employees should not have unions, okay? So this is another contention point that some people are arguing, and I don't think they should have unions. But these federal government employee unions protect a lot of their employees from getting fired for felonies. So they do get like warnings and maybe some type of violation or something, but they don't get fired. A lot of them don't go to prison for felonies. There are a lot that get away with stuff. And I've heard stories of just federal government people who saw their coworkers just abusing, stealing money, and only a report was written. There was one case, and I don't think the media covered this, where a woman was using her federal government employee expense account, and she was living high on the heel, and she had over $1 million stolen for like 5-star restaurants that she was eating at every night in the area. She was using her government employee expense account for trips. She was buying like an enormous expensive designer shoe and handbag collection and couture fashion and all this other stuff. And the government investigators like came into her house with a warrant and documented the evidence and wrote a report, and I don't think she went to prison. I think she kept her job too and her pension. Because she was in a federal government employee union, I think it saved her job. So I just wanted to, this is an episode where I'm not talking about markets, but if people, you want to refer your friends to some of just the crazy stories, there's a whole bunch more I could share. It's just countless where someone is abusing the system. There's some instances like at Freddie Mac. One of my really good friends who's a real estate agent, he met a person who moved here for Freddie Mac and got promoted to, well, she had just moved here, and she was promoted to like vice president or something of Freddie Mac. And when you're a real estate agent here in the DC metro area, because real estate is so expensive and so is rent, that you have to submit proof of income. And this woman was making like $400,000 per year plus a $400,000 bonus. And she was bragging to my friend that she hardly had to work. So in the movies and TV, they say that a lot of these federal government agents are way underpaid and they work too hard. Now, there are some who do their job and bust their ass and are underpaid, but there are a lot of them, the majority, overwhelming majority, who do not do their job, who are grossly overpaid and still complain, by the way. Hey, Watchmen, you nailed it. There is a ton of blackmail here. That show Scandal and Blackmail, there is a lot of that. I've heard stories of people taking like shared, there's that new like Lyft pool or Uber pool where friends have taken like one of those home at night, and there's been like a government employee in one of their rides who got in bragging that they just cheated on their wife at an expensive expensive downtown hotel in DC, and they used their government employee cards. Okay, it's just rampant. It's really sad. Okay, well, I know this is not one of the normal episodes. I'll take a look at listener questions and comments, but rather than me answering some stuff in the comment section about like how some of the stories I've heard over the years from federal government employees, either people who used to work there or still work there off the record, and they want the system cleaned up, but they can't do anything without risking their careers and their employees, like threatening them or turning on them. And the main thing here, guys, is the media is supposed to be the watchdog fixing this. Okay, they are, but it's not happening. The media, the main culprit here is in the past when the U.S. government was more honest and the media was more honest, they cleaned up this corruption quick. There was the tiny, compared to the unbidded government contracts that are given out today for people working in federal government to their friends so they can leave the private sector and get on the board of directors and get stock options and all that other stuff, or Congress trading on insider trades, all that other crazy stuff that is happening here, where someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez comes to Congress with a 420 credit score, broke, can barely pay her rent, and 5-10 years from now she's going to be worth like probably over $10 million. But the federal government is just a disaster of waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse. I totally forgot my train of thought, and this why I didn't write down any notes. So I'm rambling here, but I hope you understand the point I'm trying to make. I could go on and on about the stories. It's just incredibly frustrating. Look, if you're in the private sector and you go in, unless you're the boss's son or daughter, or you're screwing the boss, and you go into work once a month, you should be fired immediately, or within a couple months or something. And instead, that person has been working there for years, and then getting a mandatory pay increase for federal government employees, still has a pension, Cadillac healthcare, and probably is going to get a promotion due to seniority. It is like, I'm trying to think here. It's like the worst case scenario of carrying out the Peter principle to like comedic and tragic ends. I will talk about markets and other stuff on another show tomorrow. I was working on getting on, I almost got them on, they had to reschedule. Serpensa, which is Winston, and Matt, Lawai86, the two top China vloggers. I'm working on getting them on together for an interview. Oh, it was supposed to happen this week, it didn't, had to reschedule. And I have another interview that's probably booked for next week. I won't talk about it publicly yet, but I think you're going to like it. Okay, let me look at listener questions and comments. Scott asks, when's the revolution going to start? Well, I think I talked about this in Eat the Rich, which had over 200 likes and over 200 comments in about 24 hours and has almost no views. It has barely over 2,000 views. So that video has just been killed. I talked about this, that there is no middle ground now in the U.S. It is going towards like socialism or people on the other side who don't want that. And there is very little compromise and people willing to have polite debate and discourse in the middle. You see this with Congress too now. So, and this is third world country behavior when one political party gains a majority in both houses of Congress or one of the houses, that it's, okay, we're going to retaliate. It's time for revenge on the other party. It's time for subpoenas, investigations, scandals. Guys, it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get crazier from here on out. And this is Banana Republic, third world country type of behavior. The only difference between a Banana Republic and what is happening in the U.S. is that in the Banana Republic or third world country, the political opponents may have already been murdered or assassinated. So in the Roman Empire, towards the end, we are not at the levels where like where emperors are being assassinated, every week or two. And in a year's time, there's 10, 20, 30, 40 different emperors. We're not at that level yet. And hopefully we don't get there. Hopefully enough people will wake other people up and we will not get to a revolution, like a violent revolution. And hopefully some type of solution peaceful solution can be fixed. Can be agreed on. But when you have the world reserve currency and fiat currency and digital debt-based fiat currency and an enormous military and a welfare warfare state, this is the type of waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse that you're going to have at the end. And in the bureaucrats, if you go back through all the different empires, and by the way, the U.S.'s empire is way worse than the British Empire at this point in terms of morality. The U.S. empire is on the Romans level. But the amount of there's so many bureaucrats here in the U.S. federal government ones, and the federal government's probably going to be hiring more. Return-free risk says modern monetary theory (MMT) is the moral hazard of QE policy. Now they'll have to print money for the poor and middle class because they did it for the rich to bail out financial assets. Well, we'll see who wins the elections. They have to get the socialists installed first. But the problem with that is it's not in a vacuum, and so foreigners won't take the dollar then. So what you hear the MMT people say is that we can print all of our own national currency, but what they don't say is whether foreigners will take the currency, which they won't, by the way. And you've heard people from the Federal Reserve like Jerome Powell and others say if we do that, then the foreigners won't take our dollars. So that will just accelerate the stagflation or hyperinflation track. Thank you for the super chat donation, D's Nuts. Obviously, that's not your real name. So I just wanted to have an honest conversation here about a lot of the federal government employees. I have been contacted in the past when I was starting my podcast with a number of federal government employees off the record, speaking to them and just hearing some of the stories from different federal government agencies too. Some of the stuff was just ridiculous. There was one woman, she was so nice, and I was speaking to her for months, and she was just telling me that she just had to walk away from her nice job at the Department of Energy because she was just seeing all these people at the Department of Energy were giving out like unbidded contracts. This was during the Obama administration. Giving like unbidded contracts out to their friends in the private sector, all these alternative energy contracts, like unbidded ones that were for a lot more money, and the people who are in the DOE who are giving it out. So not only were they ideologues, so they were giving it out to bad companies, but the people were expecting like board of director seats and stock options later on. It's just sad. Oh, you mean Fairfax County, Watchman? Fairfax County in Virginia? Yeah, there's also like a sexting scandal here. It's really ridiculous, and this just shows how much moral bankruptcy there is. There's like all these underage girls that are sending out naked pictures to the guys that they like. And the guys promise that they won't share them. It's a disaster in Fairfax County. These smartphones and moral bankruptcy, it's just creating enormous problems in society. Also third and fourth wave feminism, but I don't want to talk about that on this show. But when you add all these things together, and this is why, like, when I was a teenager, I didn't have a smartphone. I didn't have a cell phone. It's probably a good thing. But now these kids, like, I saw a psychologist do an interview and say that if you give your kid in like 6th grade a cell phone, a smartphone, you have to immediately have a conversation with them that they can't do any sex and sexting, and they can't send any like naked pictures or anything. And the parents are not equipped for this stuff. A lot of parents are not equipped to have these conversations. Yeah, Peter is correct. He said in the late 90s and early 2000s, the U.S. Army was being invoiced like $20 for a screw. This corruption goes way back. Yes, and if the screw had to be imported to, say, Iraq or Afghanistan, they could charge like $100 per. So there were, at one point, for transporting oil in very dangerous areas, moving oil back and forth for the military, they were charging like over $10,000 a barrel, I want to say, for oil. That Halliburton was charging that much. Hello, Watchman, you're really on point about how crazy Fairfax County and a lot of the counties in Northern Virginia are getting. There's more taxes and more rules and more regulations and a bunch of other crazy stuff that's happening now. So eventually they're going to drive out. They're already driving out a lot of the restaurants that have been here for a very long time. It's sad too. So like Hard Times, which had been here I think since the Great Depression. Hard Times was in Arlington, and they were very well known, and I think they didn't want to pay their rent anymore and they left. Yes, I've heard the story about the $25,000 toilet seat. Yes. Dr. 8 says Trump lost to the swamp, the U.S. will collapse completely, or Trump made a deal with the military-industrial complex so they have his back, so he gives them more money, and they're kind of covering his ass. So he'll talk in public about draining the swamp, but his behavior with the amount of money he's giving the military and Pentagon budgets and stuff like that is the exact opposite. And remember how Trump changed his opinion for removing troops out of Syria? Now he's back to, I think, keeping them there. So he's had some talking to by John Bolton and the other scumbags. And it looks like at some point the U.S. is also going to go into Venezuela. Okay, guys, well, we are longer than the time I wanted to allocate. There are a lot more stories and anecdotes I've heard because I've been here so long. And you know what? The sad thing is that people will openly discuss this in public. So I'll just tell you another anecdote before I shut down the show. I just remembered it right now because my mind is kind of jambled right now. That pretty shortly after Donald Trump won the presidency. Actually, it was the inauguration. It was around January of 2017, as Trump was entering the Oval Office here after the inauguration. And my best friend and I were eating in like DC metro area restaurants, including like in DC. And we were just openly hearing like federal government employees just like laughing about how they're going to mess with Trump and like sabotage him and resist him and screw things up at their jobs and ruin things for him. So, I mean, no one's going to get in trouble for that if there's all these people, like, on the metro and in restaurants and other areas. And a lot of these government employees, guys, like, when they drink at bars and stuff like that, they really run their mouth. A lot of them don't keep secrets very well, let's just say. They brag about a lot of the things that they can get away with there on the job. So, if I was making more money, I would have left this area. This area is just... It's just unbelievable now that I've been here so long, how a lot of the people are. And they just accept it as normal. But it's a bubble. And it's divorced from reality. And it's obviously not sustainable. And it's lasted a lot longer than people thought. But my listener on the last live stream who gave me a super chat, a tip, he asked about the comparison between this and the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire lasted a lot longer than most people thought it would. Okay, I mean, it's kind of either the zombie or the person who has like a broken arm and a broken leg and he's still, kind of dragging it along there, kind of trying to walk a little bit. It's like that. So things can go on a lot longer. And that's why things haven't collapsed right away. There's other reasons why as well, like the inflation, the majority of the inflation, monetary inflation that's been created by the socialist central banks has been directed to asset prices rather than in the real economy. They managed to keep things in stagflation levels, so no hyperinflation. Okay, well, that's it for right now. Everyone have a good evening, and now that this show is done and I've rambled on for long enough, I will focus on getting back to talking about investing in the stock market. But I just wanted to share with you guys because I think some of you don't really understand how bad things are here in DC. And this area, the federal government is so damn large now in size and budget that it is an enormous parasite. There are parasites. There are private sector businesses here of all sizes that are parasites too, making money off that. That if a government agency had to cut back on budget, that the private sector business would either go bankrupt or have to fire most of their employees.